Welcome to the course Introduction to Estonian Culture, which is variously titled, as listed in your course selection guide, as Foundations for Estonian Culture or Basics of Estonian Culture. In Estonian, the term is neutral, alused. That is the building blocks that enable us to look beyond the surface, but also to read the surfaces that are around us, particularly if, as I assume most of you students are, without Estonian as a language. As you know, that is both a limiting and an enabling condition. And it is the hope that this course will allow you to question some of your initial impressions and to make you a more intelligent observer of what is around you in the, shall we say, fieldwork laboratory of contemporary Estonia. I hope that this course will consist of a coherent fragmentarium. That is in itself a paradox. Fragments in today's digital world are the units of knowledge. And the connections between those fragments sometimes emerge in surprising ways simply by juxtaposing or sequencing those fragments. However, in my own view and my own study of culture, I have imposed coherence on the fragments in order to, on the one hand, allow for a historical perspective and to eliminate some series of fragments that may create perhaps deceptive impressions of how those images connect. Because this is a course in English, we have some limitations on reading material. And for this reason, this first lecture, will draw on two texts, both written by ethnographers, one by a distinguished older ethnographer. He's in great and honorable age, Ansvires, and his book, Old Estonian Folklife, is available to most of you through a PDF file, a series of readings, and for some of you who choose to own it, you can also buy it in a bookstore. It is a good translation. The other book is called Old Estonia, and it is written by an ethnographer named Gustav Renk, who emigrated from Estonia, who fled Estonia in 1944 and lived for the rest of his life in Sweden, where he put together, both from memory and on the basis of his own research, a short volume on Estonian culture, the traditional way of life, that was then translated at Indiana University in the 1960s for the use of students in Indiana University's Finno-Ugric program, and is used to this day. So two responsible works of old ethnography that will undergird this initial encounter with Estonian culture. And as we proceed in the course, we will, by dint of necessity, rely more on images than on texts, for the reasons of translation. I don't think this is a handicap, but what I do think is that as you look at each lecture through the images that are presented, I would like you to try to focus on and retain from each lecture 3 or 4 still images. Not dynamic, moving pictures, but still images. And I think the significance of that choice will emerge as you move through the course. It will also provide a resting point for the flow of many, many pictures in what is partially, if not totally, a foreign world to those of us who may still walk on foot, but who are not used to the pace at which life moved prior to the advent of the 20th century and prior to the advent of the 1990s, as we will see. And this is often forgotten in courses in cultural history, and it is a motif that we might as well mention at the outset: the speed at which we move, the speed at which we see, and the distances that we can travel in certain units of time. So, having mentioned the concept of coherent fragmentariness, having mentioned the importance of still images, let me introduce some superficial myths that we would like to put right out into the open at the beginning of a course like this, and then hope to put into suspension points, either by adding a question mark at the end of the sentence, or putting the ellipsis or 3 dots in place so that we can end the sentence in a more detailed manner when we're through. If you walk through Tallinn and you look with the eye of a tourist, certain artifacts and certain images register for you as signals that here in this restaurant, in this marketplace, in this souvenir store, you will encounter authentic Estonian culture. If you want to take an hour of your time and move around simply from the Tallinn Rathaus Square, the marketplace square, in 3 or 4 different directions, wandering along the cobbled streets, you will have plenty of proof for this pretension of offering the visitor authentic Estonian culture. This is marketed actively in the field of cuisine. You can encounter in that little walk through the center of Tallinn several restaurants that claim to offer ethnically Estonian food. If you read the menu, you may at first believe that, but then if you think again, you have to ask yourself, what is it that is genuinely Estonian about blood sausage? Can't we encounter something very similar with Scottish haggis? What is it that is particularly Estonian about pork roast, sauerkraut, and oven-roasted potatoes? What is particularly Estonian about the interesting substance called kama, which is peas porridge elsewhere in the English-speaking world, but which makes a very satisfying summer snack when mixed with buttermilk or kefir? In the field of cuisine, then, if you go on to the bookstores that are around and you look at books written on Estonian cuisine for the foreign visitor, you may have the same kinds of questions. Is this food anything other than hearty peasant food that crosses cultures, that you can see and enjoy in many other places, and which is actually quite curious to be eating in the city at all? If you go on to the field of arts and crafts, then you will see in several souvenir shops and other more elegant boutiques the prevalence of linen clothing and of heavy woven woolen skirts, some of them striped, some of them pleated, authentic Estonian folk costumes. And if you want a memento that fits nicely into your purse or your suitcase, then you will probably see a great wealth of knitted socks and mittens. And you can ask yourself, if you have an eye for women's crafts, whether these patterns are authentically Estonian, whether they have anything to do at all with the place or the region. And you can also repeat that impression in the bookstore, since there are now several fine English language gift books that feature Estonian patterns and textiles in traditional fashion. Where is the authenticity? take the inquiry into other slightly adjacent realms, look at jewelry, and ask yourself whether, if you have any experience with the other Baltic nations, could you walk along a beach in Western Estonia and pick up pieces of Baltic amber? If not, where does this amber come from that is sold in Estonian souvenir stores? Already we have broached the surface of the tourist eye view and the intent, the wish to find something very distinctive of the region, to designate it as somehow national or somehow ethnic, and then to market it as an image that represents that authenticity. I am not here to discredit that view, but to get us to look a little deeper. I'm wearing around my neck one such fragment that is taken out of the context of its original regional culture, a piece of jewelry called the setukett, the setu chain. And as you look at the map of Estonia, that I hope will become the first of your still images for this course, and you look at this small territory of Estonia, you will realize that it is ethnically and culturally heterogeneous, to the point where locality sometimes transcends any effort to unification. The setukett belongs in the traditional women's folk costume from the southeast portion of Estonia, traditionally a very poor region agriculturally, and a region filled in its cultural framework with Russian Orthodox influence, with a dialect that is different from spoken and written Estonian as we know it today, and a region that, as contemporary ethnographers and anthropologists have studied, is often offered up as a kind of distilled Estonian authenticity, because it leaves the impression that Setu culture has been less dispersed, less violated by processes of homogenization, moving from the country to the city, that it has retained somehow in a more concentrated form its local distinctiveness. So why am I wearing a setukett? I am wearing a setukett conscious that it is a very small part of a repertoire of silver jewelry that a woman would wear, a married woman would wear, with a number of brooches. The heavier the load of silver, the more wealthy the family from which she came. There is a contemporary film that you may have even encountered if you visited a DVD store, entitled Arta. And Arta is an old Setu story about a real Setu singer, folk singer, who was one of the people who sang her folk song repertoire for Finnish ethnographers in the 1910s and 20s. Her own life story, which became the film, focuses on the lack of silver. Her father had an alcohol problem, which was not at all uncommon, and he drank away her dowry jewelry, leaving her without prospects for marriage. Why am I wearing a setukett? I'm wearing a setukett because, as a child of Estonians who fled in 1944 from the second Soviet occupation of Estonia, the setukett was one of the pieces of jewelry that silversmiths who had fled Estonia and who began practicing traditional jewelry making enjoyed making and marketed as early as a couple of years after this wave of flight west. And in my growing up years, even for children whose parents came from other parts of Estonia and had nothing to do with Setomaa, the Setu chain became a confirmation gift of choice for young women. And there are people in contemporary Setomaa who would find it quite a violation to see this chain worn out of its traditional context by someone who has no connection to the place, not to Estonia, but to Setomaa. So this is one example of the processes of cultural transfer and hybridization, and the way that artifacts, beautiful artifacts, can change context and acquire new layers of signification. The same is true, as I have already mentioned, for mittens. And of mittens we will talk from time to time later, if for no other reason than that they are a climatic necessity in Estonia, but the mittens that are marketed for tourist admiration are nowhere near thick enough for use in daily life by those who needed them to protect their hands against the cold. So there is a line of distinction between the practicalities and sometimes the lack of ornamentation of implements and tools of daily life for people living traditionally and the contemporary market in artifacts of ethnic authenticity. So we were going to talk about myths and binaries related to an initial take on Estonian culture. We talked about the tourist eye view of authenticity. The second layer, the second binary that needs to be spoken of in relation to Estonia is what literary historian Maire Janus has referred to in the title of one of her articles, Estonia and Pain. Estonia and Oppression. One cannot look at the culture of Estonia without recognizing the long imprint of foreign culture that began with the colonization of Estonia by German Roman Catholic missionaries and armed men in the beginning of the 13th century. So if you drive through Estonia looking only for wooden churches, you won't find too many wooden churches except in Setomaa, where they are Russian Orthodox houses of prayer. What you will see is small, perhaps more modest looking examples of church architecture that you would encounter in Sweden, on Gotland, in France, in Germany, in Spain, namely Gothic churches. They are built of more modest stone. They date back, the earliest ones, to the late 13th, early 14th century. But one has to ask what these houses of prayer have signified throughout the ages. Estonia and pain, Estonia and oppression, does not refer only as a trope to the fact that a foreign religion was brought in by force in the early 13th century, but that it was followed by feudalization, and the Estonian peasant quite quickly, over the course of a century or so, became a serf, bound to the land, not allowed to leave the manor under which he and his family were bound, and forced to do farm labor for the baron and landlord. In the discourse of the late 19th century national awakening, this trope, this whole cluster of historical processes, was referred to as the 700 years of slavery, which did not have an easy way of being outweighed by national independence. In the period between the First and Second World War, the only period during which Estonia had a state. So 700 years of slavery, counterpoised with a brief 20 years of freedom, of independence, is a binary opposition that circulates in many places in Estonian culture. It even circulates in the contemporary press. Yes, 700 years of slavery is a long time, but one has to nuance that totalized formula with a number of other annotations in order to understand what that was really like, what that was like regionally and locally, and what were its benefits. We will come to that later in today's lecture. The benefits right now are in double quote marks, but the benefits need to be talked about in terms of the educational institutions that came along with the territory of certain times in that 700 years of oppression. If we add another measure of time, 700 years of slavery, 20 years of freedom, and 50 years of Soviet occupation, 50 years of being part of the Soviet Union. It is too simple to paint those three periods in three separate and homogeneous colors. Toward the end of this course, we will be talking about Soviet-era Estonian culture and the complex ways in which efforts to homogenize it actually resulted in several sectors of culture in the preservation of texts, traditions, and customs. So once again, the political regime is not an easy clue to what was transpiring at various levels of life and traditional existence. So far we've talked about authenticity, Estonia and pain, and we have already broached the topic of nation and nationality, which comes along with the contemporary term national identity. Nation and state, as far as Estonia is concerned, were only congruent, that is, approximately equal, during the 20 years of interwar independence and in the emergent post-Soviet period. We can again talk about the nation equaling the state on some level. However, when we go beyond and start asking what has made Estonians Estonian, what is their national identity, this becomes a much more complex question. Is national identity configured around blood? In today's terms, genetics, population genetics. Talking about nation in terms of blood is, as we know very well, a very dangerous path to embark on, and we won't talk much about it in this course, except to mention from time to time that there have been theories, there have been efforts to define anthropologically, archaeologically, the human type that is likely to be Estonian. That is a fuzzy picture. You will read about that in your Gustav Rank book. But in today's terms, there are serious attempts to replace this configuration of looking at identity as somehow connected with blood with a broad sweep of genetic and linguistic inquiry, looking at migrations of populations according to population genetics, and then changes in language groups. And such research is cutting-edge research and requires the appropriate tools. The Estonian language belongs to the Finno-Ugric language group. And so the relationship between the Finno-Ugric language, that is Estonian, and its closest and more distant cousins comes into this grander or broader view of linguistic change as related to genetic change. However, if one asked an Estonian today, an older Estonian, let's say someone in their late 70s or early 80s, what makes an Estonian, then one way we can find out how they place themselves is to ask them whether they look at their identity in terms of the language they speak or the place that they are from. Having spent most of my recent research time examining Estonian life stories, autobiographies that common people have chosen to write down in response to calls from museums and memory banks that they record what they remember. The traditional formula for an Estonian to identify themselves is to name the place of their birth, which is usually a town or a place in the country that they go on then to identify by village, and sometimes the name of the farm on which they were born, and then the language that they speak. So language and place, more than blood or genetics, attachment to the land and speaking a particular language seem to be the favored terms for locating oneself as an Estonian. Many families can trace their pedigree, their genealogy back for several generations on the same patch of land or in the same, say, 10 to 25 kilometer radius. It is somewhat different for people who locate their place of birth in the city, because chances are that a couple of generations earlier, that would not have been the case. Someone among their grandparents or great-grandparents' generation, sometime around the turn of the 20th century, moved from the country to the city. And we'll come back to that at the close of this lecture as a major theme in the cultural shifts in the last couple of centuries in Estonia, the movement of people from the country to the city. But remaining on the topic of language for just a moment longer, we observe that up until the beginning of the 19th century, an Estonian would not refer to themselves as an Estonian, but probably with the term maamees, a man of the country, a man of the land, or collectively maarahvas, people of the country, people of the land. Scholars of the social history of the Estonian language claim that this is a rather modest and indistinctive way of establishing who one is, especially if one looks at the centuries-long structure of land holding by means of the baron, the landowner, the mõisnik, and the peasantry. The peasantry are just what they say they are, people of the country, people of the land, not Estonians in the language of nation. And in our next lecture, we will talk a little bit more in detail about when the ethnonym came into usage, when Estonians began to be referred to, now by the upper crust of their rulers, not as Esten, that is ethnically Estonian people, but as Undeutsche, as non-Germans. That is the way it would look if the German looks at everybody else, the majority of the folks living on the land. That's what they are. They are not positively something, they are not something. So I'd like you to retain this paradox that though we tend in the language of scholarship to overuse terms such as nationality and national identity, as well as the word tradition, then if we talk about Estonian identity in relation to nationality, we are better off talking about land and language and observing very closely the way that language and place intersect in such terms as from below, maamees and maarahvas, and from above, undeutsche. So now we've talked about three of the myths or three of the impressions of Estonian culture: the tourist, authenticity, Estonia and pain, and we've talked about the nation. And there's one more that I'd like to add to this because it plays an important role throughout Estonian cultural history and a great deal more weight as we look from our contemporary standpoint at what is happening in Estonian culture today. And that is the dialectic, and here I would really call it a dialectic, of Estonia and Europe. And since becoming a member of the European Union in 2004, Estonia does proudly consider itself to be part of Europe and to insist again and again on continuities, contact points, and connection points with European culture. And if this is done uncritically and without any historical perspective, then one finds that both scholars and journalists misread the signals of that connection. And they forget that 150 years ago, a typical villager who had any business transactions at all with the town and perhaps with the fair or the marketplace, that person would have known, in terms of functional linguistic competency, three local languages. Maakeel, the language of the country, that is Estonian, whatever dialect the region had. And the other two local languages would be German and Russian. This was just in order to be able to communicate. And this is something, again, I'd like you to retain and mull over as the course unfolds, because if at the turn of the century, into the 20th century that is, a person who went to school, acquired even an elementary education, would have had a smattering of German and Russian in addition to Estonian, and if right at the moment when Estonian independence was being endangered by the first Soviet occupation in 1940, that is, going into the Second World War, it was fairly typical that someone who had graduated from high school was fluent in German and Estonian. That could no longer be assumed as far as Russian was concerned. Because in independent Estonia, Russian was no longer a mandatory school subject. And this had large consequences for people in their somewhat difficult, if not tragic, trajectories during the war years. Knowledge of the three local languages continued to be a very strong adaptive advantage. And if we compare at the third moment, that is today, how many Estonians know how to speak the three local languages that were the three local languages at the turn of the 20th century, one would say that, quite sadly, German has gone practically out of usage. It is not taught as a mandatory subject. It is taught in some schools where it is a facultative subject, a elective. And Russian language is not mandatory in Estonian schools, despite the fact that there is a significant minority of Russian school children for whom the perceived key to success is not only knowledge of Estonian, but English. So English has replaced, and this is not just my view, but I think a prevalent view, English has replaced both Russian and German as the second local language. So if we look at both national identity and cultural history in light of this, what happens to the paradox of Estonia and Europe? What is the ticket for moving freely between Estonia and the rest of Europe? Not necessarily a deep cultural literacy, but rather knowledge of English and of international, if not global, bureaucratic institutions. So the paradox of Estonia and Europe at certain moments in cultural history became a dialectic that was highly visible. One such moment was the period of time between the early 1900s and the 1920s, as Estonia was on the path not just to political independence, but to a greater integration with respect to its high culture, its literature, and its arts into the mainstream of not just Scandinavian, but European culture in general. And now again, in the post-Soviet, post-European Union admission, attempt to become maximally linked, maximally connected to European cultural institutions. What we forget, though, if we only stress those two moments of Estonia in relation to Europe, is the relations, the cultural contacts with Russia, and we also neglect those same 700 years of servitude and of enculturation that was brought by the German colonization, the strata ranging from the stone churches to the schools to the written Estonian culture, the interest in the language, the first grammars of the Estonian language that came with the territory of that colonization. So in that sense, Estonia was always already in Europe, at least since the time of colonization. And on your reading list of other optional readings, you will find Robert Bartlett's articles that situate the Baltic nations in the context of the larger framework of European culture at the beginning of that period of colonization, and Bartlett's treatment of the cultural processes that ensued doesn't erase that 700 years of actual European belonging that was intensified in the moments that I've mentioned. So this is the first part of our encounter with Estonian culture through what are some rather simplistic binary formulations, some cliches that are at large in the culture, and that I hope that we will begin to problematize in the coherent fragmentarium of this course. So this is the first take, and we will shortly move on to the next layer of binaries and problematics of engaging Estonian culture at a deeper level.